Ruth Miller sat alone in her tidy kitchen, her wrinkled hands smoothing the petals of the white corsage she planned to wear. It was an elegant bloom, pinned carefully to the pale blue jacket she had pressed the night before. The scent reminded her of her wedding day, though that felt like someone else's life now. She glanced at the clock, 6:12 p.m. In less than an hour, she would be standing inside the gleaming ballroom of the Carlton Country Club, surrounded by Edward's colleagues and the family members who still believed her son was a pillar of virtue. She swallowed a tightness in her throat. For most of her 78 years, Ruth had clung to the simple belief that respectability was worth any sacrifice. It was what she and George built together, a life that, brick by brick, turned from struggle to pride. George worked until his hands were raw, hauling freight to pay for Edward's tuition. Ruth took in mending and cleaned houses so their only child would have a life better than their own. And Edward delivered. He rose from a warehouse clerk to CEO of Northern Transport Logistics. He had a house with stone columns, a vacation cabin in Montana, and a polished reputation that earned him awards. Tonight's party was a testament to all of it. But when she turned her gaze to the envelope resting at the edge of the kitchen table, a deep chill settled through her. It had come that morning, no return address, no note, just a stack of photographs and a single hotel receipt. The images were grainy but unmistakable. Edward, in his pressed shirt sleeves, cupping the cheek of a woman whose face Ruth had seen dozens of times across Edward's holiday tables. Holly, the secretary who smiled a little too brightly when Edward introduced her, the one he insisted was just a hard-working young woman. Ruth picked up the top photo again, as if her eyes might find some new explanation she'd overlooked. But there was Edward, tilting Holly's chin up to kiss her mouth in the glow of a parking lot lamp. The timestamp was only 3 weeks old. Her first instinct had been to burn the evidence, to protect Edward, to pretend ignorance. But then she'd closed her eyes and heard George's voice, raspy from decades of cigarettes and hard work, telling her, "If you ever see our boy losing his way, you promise me you'll set him straight." Tears stung her eyes. She had promised. Ruth pressed her palm flat against the photos. The weight of them felt heavier than anything she had carried in years. She thought of Susan, sweet, loyal Susan, who had loved Edward since college and never once complained about the late nights, the canceled vacations, the birthday dinners Edward missed in the name of the company. What would it do to Susan to find out this way? What would it do to their grandchildren who thought the world of their grandfather? Her chest ached with the knowledge that no matter what she chose, someone she loved would be hurt. But another thought came to her. Someone was already being hurt. It was just hidden behind polite smiles and whispered excuses. Ruth pushed her chair back and rose slowly, her knees stiff. She retrieved her purse from the counter and slipped the envelope inside. For a moment, she simply stood there, staring out the window at the darkening yard. "You'll forgive me one day," she whispered to no one. She turned off the kitchen light. The ride to the country club felt unreal. Each mile seemed to carry her further from the life she understood and deeper into a place she couldn't yet see the end of. But Ruth knew this much. She would not pretend everything was fine. Not tonight. When she arrived at the club's grand entrance, she sat in the car for a long moment, hand resting on the door handle, feeling her heartbeat echo in her palms. And when she finally stepped out into the golden glow of the lanterns, corsage pinned and shoulders straight, she felt the strange clarity of a woman who had nothing left to lose but her own conscience. The grand ballroom of the Carlton Country Club was a cathedral of polished veneer. Gleaming chandeliers poured soft light onto the crowd of nearly 200 guests. Waiters in crisp black uniforms glided between the tables, offering trays of sparkling wine and canapes arranged with fussy precision. At the far end of the hall, an enormous banner stretched across the wall. "Congratulations, Edward. 35 years of excellence." Ruth paused in the doorway, adjusting her glasses as she scanned the crowd. A ripple of warmth swept through her as old acquaintances spotted her and waved. Faces from the church, the neighborhood, and the company Edward had led for decades. She offered them polite nods but kept her gaze searching for two people in particular. She found Susan first. Susan stood near the stage in a simple navy dress, her blonde hair styled in soft waves. She held a glass of wine, chatting with Edward's longtime CFO and his wife. Her laugh rang out, genuine and unguarded. Ruth's stomach twisted. She wanted to cross the room and pull Susan into her arms to shield her from what was coming, but instead she looked beyond her, to the man of the hour. Edward was surrounded by admirers. He wore a dark suit and a silver tie, a color Susan had always said brought out the blue in his eyes. He looked trim and confident, years younger than his 60 years. He was leaning down to speak to a woman at his side. Holly. Holly wore a tight red cocktail dress that clung to her slim figure. Her dark hair fell in loose curls over one shoulder. Even at a distance, Ruth could see the possessive way Holly's hand rested on Edward's arm. No one else seemed to notice, or maybe no one dared to care. Ruth's breath came shallow. She forced herself to step forward, moving past clusters of colleagues and old friends offering congratulations. "Ruth," called Marlene Sims, the HR director's wife, giving her a kiss on the cheek. "Doesn't Edward look wonderful tonight?" And Susan planned everything down to the last detail. "You must be so proud." Proud. The word nearly caught in Ruth's throat. She managed a brittle smile. "Yes, thank you, Marlene." She kept moving. Each step felt heavier, as if she were wading through water. From the edge of the dance floor, she watched Edward and Holly laugh at some private joke. When Edward's hand slid to the small of Holly's back, Ruth felt her heart clench. It was so casual, so practiced. Had no one else seen? Or was everyone simply too polite or too afraid to admit what was happening in plain sight? Ruth thought of the photos in her bag. She thought of George's raspy voice telling her that dignity mattered more than comfort. She turned away, searching the room for anyone who might confirm what she already knew. Her gaze landed on Greg Davenport, Edward's old friend and the vice president of Northern Transport. Greg stood near the bar, a tumbler of scotch in his hand. He looked tired, the corners of his mouth pulled down in resignation. Ruth felt an instinctive pull toward him. Greg had known Edward since college. If anyone could be honest, it was him. She made her way to him, ignoring the tremor in her hands. "Greg," she said quietly when she reached his side. He turned and gave her a warm, surprised smile. "Ruth, I'm so glad you came. Edward will be thrilled." She studied his face. "You know why I'm here, don't you?" His expression faltered. I'm not sure I understand." "Don't lie to me, Greg. I've known you since you were a boy." His eyes dropped to the rim of his glass. "Ruth." She waited, her silence louder than any accusation. Greg sighed. "I didn't want to be the one to say it, but yes, people have talked for over a year." Her mouth went dry. "So it's true." Greg nodded reluctantly. "Edward has been involved with Holly. It's been a poorly kept secret among some of us, but no one wanted to embarrass Susan." Ruth looked past him to where her son and his secretary stood laughing under the golden light. "Thank you for your honesty," she said, her voice steady even as her heart slammed in her chest. Greg set his glass down. "What are you going to do?" Ruth felt the envelope pressing against her ribs like a brand. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I can't pretend I don't see it." Greg nodded, sorrow flickering in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Ruth. Truly." She turned back to the crowd, and for a moment, everything seemed suspended in unreal stillness. On the stage, a microphone squealed as a young man tested the sound. Then Edward stepped up to the podium. The applause began, and Ruth felt something inside her fracture. Her son raised his hands for quiet, smiling as if nothing were amiss, as if the life he'd built and the wife he'd sworn to love were still whole. Ruth felt her fingers tighten around the strap of her handbag. No more pretending. Edward's voice poured through the speakers, warm and polished. "I want to thank all of you for being here tonight," he began, scanning the crowd as though this were simply another business conference, another opportunity to collect applause. 35 years, it's hard to believe, but it all went by so fast. The crowd chuckled appreciatively. Ruth stood near the back, her heart knocking against her ribs. She wished she could slip away, just quietly vanish before she had to decide whether to keep the peace or speak the truth. But her feet stayed rooted to the parquet floor. She watched Edward rest one hand lightly on the podium. The other hand, she noticed, brushed briefly against Holly's waist as she hovered near the steps. A small, intimate touch that made Ruth's stomach twist. As he continued thanking board members, employees, and lifelong friends, her thoughts drifted back decades. She was 19 when she met George. He was already driving long-haul routes to put food on his family's table. He used to come home with his arms so tired he could hardly lift them, but he'd kiss her cheek, smile at little Edward and say, "I'm doing this so he won't have to." George had been a man of few words. He never chased glory, never needed an audience, but he believed in decency, showing up when you said you would, doing the right thing when no one was watching. Ruth blinked back the sting in her eyes. Her mind replayed the night George died in his sleep. Edward had flown in late from a trade conference. He'd sat by the hospital bed in an expensive suit that smelled faintly of scotch and stale air. In the dim room, George's last words were a ragged whisper only she had heard. "Look after him. Keep him honest." At the time, she thought he was worrying over nothing. Edward was already an executive, already admired. But now, watching him stand in front of a crowd and pretend, she felt her late husband's words echo in every hollow space inside her. Edward's voice wavered slightly as he began thanking Susan. "My wife, my rock, who has kept me grounded," he said. "I owe so much to you." Susan beamed up at him, tears in her eyes. She looked proud, radiant, oblivious. Ruth's throat burned. How many times had she stood behind George at the church bake sale or at Edward's school plays, thinking how lucky she was to have a man who never betrayed her trust. She looked at Susan and felt her heart splinter. Ruth could almost hear her own conscience speaking. "If you do nothing, you are as guilty as he is." Her gaze shifted to Holly. The young woman looked too self-assured, too comfortable. She wasn't sorry, not yet. The applause swelled again as Edward finished thanking everyone for their loyalty and faith. He raised his glass. "To the next chapter," he declared. Glasses clinked throughout the ballroom. Laughter rippled. Ruth felt something harden inside her, a quiet finality she hadn't expected. She stepped backward, unnoticed in the commotion, and slipped down the hall that led to the staff area behind the stage. The corridor smelled of lemon polish and old carpet. A dull hum of voices and music leaked through the walls. She walked past stacked chairs and trays of empty glasses. Stopping near the door she knew Edward would use to slip away once his speech ended. It felt surreal to be here, waiting like a conspirator. Her hand rested on her purse. She could almost feel the edges of the photographs beneath the leather flap. "You can still walk away," she told herself. "You could pretend you never saw any of it." But she knew she wouldn't. Ruth thought of George's tired eyes, of the quiet sacrifices that built this life. She thought of Susan's trusting smile and the grandchildren who would learn eventually that even heroes could fall. She had loved her son every day of his life, but love didn't mean surrendering her principles. Footsteps approached from the ballroom. Ruth straightened her shoulders, wiped her damp palms on her skirt, and faced the door. The knob turned. Edward stepped through, pulling the door closed behind him. He didn't see her at first. He was rubbing his eyes with one hand. When he looked up and saw her standing there, he froze. "Mother," he said, voice tightening, "what are you doing back here?" Ruth took a breath, the words pressing against her tongue like a confession and a verdict all at once. "We need to talk," she said, "now." For a moment, neither of them moved. Edward's face was carefully neutral, but the flicker of panic in his eyes betrayed him. "Mother," he said again, his voice pitched low, "this isn't the time. You can't be back here." Ruth's hand closed around the strap of her handbag. She stepped forward, closing the space between them, and looked up into the face she had known since it was soft with baby fat. "You're going to listen to me," she said quietly, but with a firmness that left no room for argument. He sighed and glanced over his shoulder, as if to be sure no one else was watching. Then he gestured to a side door that led into a small storage room lined with banquet chairs and extra table linens. "Fine," he said tightly. 2 minutes. Inside, the air was stale and smelled faintly of floor wax. Edward closed the door behind them, his shoulders squaring like a man preparing for a fight. Ruth looked at him, really looked at him, and saw all the things she had tried not to see. The arrogance, the entitlement, the thin sheen of charm that cracked when it was challenged. She reached into her purse and withdrew the envelope. Edward's gaze dropped to her hands, and his face drained of color. "What is that?" he asked, though his tone said he already knew. She didn't waste time. She laid the photos on a folded tablecloth and spread them so he could see every image. Edward's breath came ragged. He didn't touch them. "Where did you get these?" "It doesn't matter," Ruth said. "They're real." He lifted his eyes, and for an instant she saw something like shame flicker there, quick and unguarded. But it was gone as soon as it appeared, replaced by that smooth, practiced calm he wore at board meetings. "This isn't what it looks like." Ruth's voice rose before she could stop it, low and sharp. "Don't insult me." Edward pressed his lips into a line. "You have no idea how complicated this is." She folded her hands to stop them from trembling. "Then explain it to me." His jaw flexed. "Susan and I haven't been happy in years. We've been living like roommates." "And Holly?" "She understands me," he said, his tone softening in a way that made Ruth's stomach turn. "She listens. She supports me. I don't expect you to understand, Mother." "No," she interrupted, her voice tightening. "I don't understand how you can stand up there and thank Susan for her loyalty when you've been betraying her behind her back." He looked away, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. Ruth continued, her voice steady even as her heart thundered. "Your father worked himself to death so you could have this life," she said. "He believed that decency mattered more than ambition. And you've forgotten everything he taught you." Edward's eyes flashed. "Don't you dare lecture me. You don't know what it's like to carry this weight, to be the one everyone expects to be perfect." Ruth shook her head. "You're not perfect. You're human. But you don't get to pretend you haven't hurt people. Susan loves you. Your children love you, and you've made a fool of all of them." He swallowed hard, and for a moment she thought he might apologize. But then his expression hardened again. "I'm retiring," he said. "I've given everything to this company and this family. I deserve to be happy." Ruth felt something break inside her. Not just sorrow, but a deep, cold disappointment. "Happiness built on deceit is no happiness at all," she said. He took a step toward her. "What do you want from me? Do you want me to grovel? To throw myself on Susan's mercy in front of everyone?" "I want you to tell her the truth," Ruth said simply, "before I do." He drew back, his face paling again. "You wouldn't." Ruth lifted her chin. "If you refuse to tell her, I will." Edward clenched his fists at his sides. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, mother and son, each seeing the other more clearly than they ever had. Then his shoulders slumped, as though the fight had drained out of him. "Mother," he whispered, "please." "Not tonight." Her eyes filled with tears. "Then when? After the applause dies down? After you've lied to everyone you claim to love?" He didn't answer. Ruth took a shaky breath. "If you won't end this yourself," she said softly, "then you leave me no choice." She gathered the photos and slid them back into the envelope. Edward's eyes followed her hands, his own expression stricken. "Don't do this," he said, voice low and pleading. But she had already turned for the door. Ruth stepped out of the storage room into the hushed hallway. The music from the ballroom drifted faintly around her, soft piano chords overlaying polite laughter and the clink of glassware. Her steps felt both heavy and strangely light, like she was no longer entirely anchored to the ground. Behind her, Edward didn't follow right away. For a moment, she imagined he might run, leave through a side door, abandon the party and everyone in it. But when she glanced back, he was still standing in the doorway, watching her with a stunned, haunted look. She turned away and started down the hall, each stride a quiet declaration that she was done pretending. When she reached the threshold of the ballroom again, the crowd had reformed around the dance floor. Edward's colleagues and old friends were gathered in a semicircle, listening to Susan speak into the microphone. Susan's voice was warm, her smile unguarded. "And I just want to say, Edward, you've been not only an extraordinary leader, but a loving husband and father," she said, her gaze adoring as she looked for her husband. "None of this would have been possible without you." The guests applauded. Someone whistled. Ruth felt her throat close. She moved closer, her heart beating so fast it blurred the edges of her vision. And then she was standing just behind Susan, envelope in hand, as Susan lowered the microphone. Edward slipped through the side entrance, pale and shaken. His eyes locked on Ruth's, and she saw the unspoken plea there. Don't do it. Not like this. She drew in a long breath. Her hands were steady as she stepped forward. The nearest guest fell silent first, noticing her approach. Conversations died off in ripples until the room was filled only with the hush of curiosity and the faint music still drifting from the speakers. Susan turned and smiled, surprised. Ruth, is everything all right? Ruth took the microphone from her gently, her voice softer than she expected when she spoke. I'm sorry, she said, meeting Susan's bewildered eyes, but there is something I need to say. A nervous shifting spread through the crowd. Edward took a single step forward, his mouth opening as if to protest. Ruth held up her free hand. Please, Edward, she said, her voice still calm. Let me finish. For a moment he froze, caught between his instinct to control the narrative and the knowledge that he no longer could. He lowered his hands but didn't sit. Ruth looked out over the sea of expectant faces. Some were frowning, confused. Others already guessed that something had ruptured beneath the surface of this carefully orchestrated night. She drew in a breath that seemed to fill her whole chest. I've always believed that integrity matters more than comfort, she began, her voice clear but quivering, just enough to betray her grief. More than reputation, even more than love, sometimes. A few people shifted uncomfortably. For most of my life, I thought my family shared that conviction, she continued, that we believed in telling the truth, even when it hurt. Susan's smile had faded completely. Edward stood motionless near the stage steps, his jaw clenched. Ruth's hand shook as she lifted the envelope slightly. I didn't want to do this here, she said, but I won't be complicit in a lie that will damage so many people. She looked directly at Susan. I am so sorry, she whispered. Susan's eyes flickered between Ruth and Edward, confusion turning to dread. Ruth set the microphone back in the stand. She unfolded the photographs one by one and laid them on the edge of the stage. The nearest guest gasped, some recoiling as though the evidence itself were radioactive. A strangled hush fell over the room. Susan stared down at the photos without reaching for them. When she lifted her gaze to Edward, her voice was almost childlike in its disbelief. Edward, she said softly, tell me this isn't real. Edward swallowed. For a moment, Ruth thought, hoped, that he would finally say the words that might salvage some small piece of himself. But he said nothing. The silence deepened until it was unbearable. A woman near the back put her hand over her mouth. A man in a tailored suit let out a low whistle. Holly, standing in the shadows near the bar, turned and fled toward the exit, her heels clacking sharply on the tile. Susan took a step back from Edward, her face white as a linen sheet. After everything, she whispered. Her voice cracked on the last word. She turned away, clutching the edge of a table as if she might collapse. Ruth descended the steps, her knees weak. She felt as though she'd split her own heart open alongside everyone else's. Edward finally moved. He stepped onto the stage, hands raised as if to stop the exodus already starting at the edge of the room. Please, everyone, just give us a moment, he stammered. But no one was listening anymore. As Ruth reached a chair along the side wall and sat down, she realized there was no going back. She had done what she promised George she would. She had tried to keep their son honest. And in doing so, she had torn open the life Edward had built to hide his shame. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Ruth sat in the chair, her hands folded in her lap, as the ballroom seemed to tilt and spin around her. She heard the murmurs rising, the scrape of chairs being pushed back, the first brave souls slipping out the doors in a hush of expensive shoes on marble. At the edge of the dance floor, Susan remained frozen, staring blankly at the photos. Edward hovered near her, his hands fluttering helplessly in the air. Susan, listen to me, he pleaded, voice cracking. It isn't what it looks like, please. Susan slowly lifted her gaze. When she spoke, her voice was stripped of all pretense, raw with the kind of hurt that had no name. How long? She asked. Edward's mouth opened, but no sound came out. How long? She repeated. Louder now, her voice ringing in the stunned silence. Edward finally whispered, "Over a year." The hush shattered into 100 sharp breaths, like a glass dropped from a great height. Susan's shoulders caved. For a moment, she looked impossibly small, dwarfed by the grandeur of the chandeliers and the eyes watching her ruin. Then something shifted in her face, a hardening Ruth had never seen in the sweet girl who had married her son all those years ago. Susan straightened. She picked up the microphone with a calm that seemed to astonish even her. "You've all heard enough," she said, her voice steady. "I won't be part of this charade another second." She set the microphone back down with a click that echoed in the hush. Then she lifted her chin, turned her back on Edward, and walked down the aisle between the tables. No one tried to stop her. Ruth's throat burned with something between heartbreak and relief. She knew in some distant corner of her mind that this was the moment her family's story would be rewritten forever. Edward moved to follow Susan, but she held out a hand without turning around. "Don't," she said, her voice low, but carrying through the entire room. He stopped, his arms dropping to his sides. For the first time in her life, Ruth saw her son truly powerless. Susan kept walking, her steps slow but unflinching, until she reached the double doors. She pushed them open, and they swung closed behind her with a soft finality that seemed to echo louder than any applause could have. The room erupted in low murmurs, pockets of whispered speculation. A few guests slipped out, heads bowed in discomfort. Ruth watched Edward turn in a slow circle, as if expecting someone to step forward and rescue him from the wreckage. But no one did. Near the bar, Greg Davenport shook his head slowly. His expression was both sad and unsurprised. Edward's gaze finally found Ruth, still seated at the edge of the room. He took a step toward her. His voice was hoarse. "Mother, why?" Ruth felt tears rising again, but she didn't look away. "Because," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable, "I couldn't watch you become a man your father would have pitied." He flinched as if she had struck him. Someone dropped a glass at a nearby table. The thin stem snapped, shards scattering across the floor. The sound startled Ruth back to herself. She pressed a hand over her mouth, fighting the dizziness that threatened to overtake her. Greg appeared at her side and gently touched her shoulder. "Ruth, are you all right?" She nodded shakily. I need to sit a moment longer." "You've done enough," Greg said gently. "Let me get you some water." She watched him disappear into the crowd, grateful for the small mercy of his kindness. Edward stood motionless at the edge of the stage, his face ashen. He looked older in that moment than she had ever seen him, as though the years he'd spent hiding from himself had finally caught up all at once. All the guests who remained seemed to keep a deliberate distance, as if his disgrace might be contagious. Ruth closed her eyes, her breath hitching in her chest. She knew she had ripped something apart tonight that might never be mended. And yet, beneath the ache and the shame, she also felt a terrible, steady relief. She had done what she promised George she would. No more secrets, no more pretending. When she opened her eyes again, Edward was staring back at her, stricken. She met his gaze without blinking. And in that long, silent moment, she understood that love did not always mean protecting someone from the consequences of their choices. Sometimes love meant bearing witness as the truth did its necessary work. Morning light streamed through Ruth's kitchen window, golden and too bright for how hollow she felt inside. The teapot sat untouched on the stove, and the plate of toast she'd prepared was cold and forgotten. She sat at the table in her bathrobe, staring at the front page of the local business section. Northern Transport CEO's retirement, gala ends in scandal. Affair exposed. A photo accompanied the headline, Edward standing on the ballroom stage, face ghost white, while Susan walked away with her chin high. The phone on the counter had rung 3 times already that morning. She hadn't picked up. She didn't want to hear the gossip, the outrage, or even the well-meaning sympathy. Her heart ached with an exhaustion too deep to describe. She had tried to steel herself for this moment. She had known that by unmasking Edward's deception, she would also be laying bare her own failure, her inability to teach him better, to keep him anchored to the principles his father had lived by. But as she traced the edge of the newspaper with a trembling finger, she told herself the same truth she had clung to all night. Lies were poison. If she had kept silent, the poison would have spread to everyone Edward claimed to love. A knock rattled the doorframe. She started, turning to see Edward standing on her porch. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. His hair was mussed, and there were deep shadows under his eyes. For one surreal instant, she saw not the aging executive, but the little boy who used to stand there with scraped knees, waiting to be let in after getting into trouble. She rose slowly and opened the door. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Edward swallowed, his voice rough. "May I come in?" She nodded and stepped aside. He moved to the kitchen table and sank into the chair opposite hers. He didn't look at the newspaper. Ruth returned to her seat, her hands folded carefully in her lap. The silence between them was dense, a space filled with the things that could never fully be unsaid. Finally, he lifted his eyes. "I suppose I should congratulate you," he said, his voice hollow. "You've made sure everyone knows the truth." Ruth's throat constricted. "Edward." He held up a hand. "No, let me finish." He drew in a shaking breath. "I spent all night thinking about what you did," he continued. "At first, I was furious. I told myself you humiliated me because you never really respected me." His gaze dropped to the table where a splotch of tea stained the old varnish. "But the more I thought about it, the more I realized you did it because you did respect me. You respected me enough not to let me keep lying." Ruth's eyes blurred with tears she couldn't fight. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't even know if Susan ever will. But I needed to tell you that you were right." He finally looked up, and she saw how broken he was, how stripped of every illusion he had carried for so long. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Ruth pressed a hand to her mouth as a sob tore free. She hadn't known how desperately she needed to hear those words. When she found her voice, it was soft and unsteady. "You are my son," she said. "I have loved you every day of your life. But love doesn't mean letting you hurt other people without consequence." He nodded slowly, tears sliding down his lined cheeks. "I know," he said. "I think part of me knew it had to end this way. I was just too much of a coward to do it myself." They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, a sparrow chirped on the porch railing, oblivious to the quiet wreckage inside the house. Finally, Edward spoke again, voice hoarse. "Do you think Susan will ever speak to me?" Ruth hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted, "but if she has any chance of forgiving you, it will only be because you told her the truth now, not years from now." His shoulders sagged, and he nodded. "Thank you," he whispered, "for being braver than I ever was." Ruth reached across the table and took his hand. For a moment, they were only a mother and her son again. Two imperfect people trying to find their way back to something that resembled decency. She knew the road ahead would be long and littered with regret, but for the first time in years, she also believed it might eventually lead them to something better. A week later, Ruth stood at George's grave beneath the old oak. The summer wind tugged gently at her hair as she set a small bouquet down on the grass. "I kept my promise," she whispered, "even when it broke my heart." Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from Susan. "Thank you for your courage. I need time, but I don't hate you for telling me the truth." Ruth closed her eyes, relief and sorrow mingling in her chest. Edward had resigned from the board. The affair had ended quietly after Holly left town. The house he'd shared with Susan now stood mostly empty. Nothing would ever be the same. But in the quiet of the cemetery, Ruth felt something like peace. She turned to leave, pausing to look back once more at George's name etched in stone. "Love you," she murmured. Then she walked away into the morning light, her heart lighter, her conscience clear, and her family, however wounded, finally free of the secrets that had poisoned them all.